Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about Oyewumi's piece on visualizing the body. This is one chapter of a book of hers. This text may seem fairly complicated on first looking at it, but hopefully we can flesh out some of the main points that Oyewumi is trying to make in this piece. Oyewumi is arguing here that biologic is understood to be universal by Westerners. She's particularly targeting Western feminists here, but she's claiming that biologic is not universal. It's a Western framework for perceiving the world in which difference and hierarchy are understood as biologically determined. So first we need to understand what she means by biologic. Biologic is a kind of framework or a filter of body-centric reasoning through which knowledge about a given society is produced due to a Western privileging of sight as the primary sense for perceiving the world. So biologic is not a particular set of ideas or concepts per se. It's a structure of reasoning. It's a cognitive habit that depends upon our over-reliance on vision and under-reliance on our other senses, such as hearing, that lead us to put the body at the center of what and how we know the world. On Oyewumi's view, biologic is harmful because it forecloses the ability of persons and cultures to understand their reality and to build knowledge about particular societies and people. So on Oyewumi's view, she's critiquing biologic itself and our reliance in the West on sight as a means of perceiving the world as a cognitive habit. And she's arguing that the problem might not be the identity categories themselves, gender categories, for example, categories of race, but the problem might be the way in which we approach the world. So we might ask ourselves, what could we do without vision? Body logic or biologic is not new in the West. Oyewumi's text is a response to Beauvoir and others who, in talking about social constructionism, have actually reified biologic, since, as we'll see, Oyewumi believes that social constructionism and biological determinism are just two different sides of the same coin. Body centricity is at the basis or the foundation of both of these ways of reasoning. So Oyewumi argues that the gaze itself is an invitation to differentiate. Because the body is always in view and on view, bodies become the foundation of social categories, and thus they are given a logic of their own. So as a kind of social bedrock for the framework of knowledge in our society, the body is not an essential or universal fact. It's merely a framework. It's merely our Western framework that takes the body to be central to social identity categories and to the ways in which we perceive the world. So biologic as a particular framework has been mystified in the West. Recall from Bartkey's piece what it means to be mystified. The fact that biologic even is a framework doesn't show up. We don't see it as a framework, we just see it as the way that things are. This is problematic to Oyewumi because we simultaneously rely on biologic as if it is a natural universal fact, yet we appeal to the fact of rational man as the ideal in Western thought. Despite our dependence on biologic in the West is viewed as the locus of rational thought by which bodilessness is a precondition of rationality. So there's this seeming paradox here. Oyewumi is making the point that we both rely on biologic as a means of knowing the world that is body-centric, and simultaneously, from within that biological framework, we claim that bodilessness is a precondition of rationality. So recall Beauvoir's account, where she describes how males are seen as subjects, females as objects, males as selves, females as others. And to be a subject is to be a rational male, to be a mind, so to speak, to be disembodied, abstract, unbiased. whereas to be a female is to be emotional, bodily, embodied, biased. So within this tradition of biologic that is founded on a body-centric way of viewing the world, there's a dichotomy of who is seen to be hierarchically superior within this logic and who is seen to be hierarchically inferior. And that hierarchy, these dualisms of male-female, nature-nurture, nature-culture, able-bodied, disabled, heterosexual, homosexual, these dualisms that we operate on are all body-centric, and they impose a kind of hierarchy wherein certain bodies are superior to other bodies. And so, despite the putting forth of the bodilessness of the rational man, that way of seeing things as one side of a binary where woman is emotional and irrational is itself based on a kind of biologic where the body is at the basis of those social categories. And therefore, it's hard to extricate the social from the biologically determined. And for Oyewumi, this is due to our reliance on vision. We're concerned with gazing at bodies and putting particular bodies into social categories, rather than using social factors to put persons or things into social categories. As Oyewumi suggests, our language itself illustrates this. We talk about having a world view and a vision. And when we talk about knowledge, we say, do you see what I mean? Let me illuminate this for you. So much of our language in talking about what we know is discussed through the metaphor of vision, and that's likely not an accident. So for Oyewumi, she says, in the Yoruban culture, they don't use the term worldview, they use the term world sense, which does not privilege vision as a way of knowing the world. Moreover, knowledge production is embedded in an everyday common sense of race in the West, and an everyday common sense of gender, sexuality, able-bodiedness, class, and so on. So what she means when she says that knowledge production is embedded in an everyday common sense of race, she's arguing that race is a fundamental organizing principle, which is based on a biological foundation. So the point here is that social categories, though we've been talking about ways in which we can demystify the fact that race is not biologically determined, it's a social fact, gender is not biologically determined, it's a social fact, sexuality is not biologically determined, it's a social fact. The knowledge that we have in this society is embedded in biologic as a fundamental organizing principle of our logic. She explains that in this way. So even sociology and philosophy, which claim to be critical about biological determinism, depend upon biological determinism to discuss social constructionism. For example, studies of criminal activity are tied up with who is involved in the activity. What kind of bodies are we talking about when we talk about criminals? Why is this a study in the first place? Why do we study the things that we study? So we're guided within the framework of biologic. Biologic is the framework within which our knowledge is processed. And biology becomes the foundation of difference in social categories. And she mentions several social categories, such as voters, citizens, the underclass, criminals, executives, farmers, and all of these seem to be social categories, even when we're talking about them in a way that we try to argue that they're not biologically determined categories, yet these kinds of discussions are still rooted in biologic because this is the framework within which we know. So, for example, if we talk about the category presidents, what do the bodies look like that make up this group? What about slaves, professors, women, men? Why are we talking about these groups as groups? We're talking about these groups as groups because These groups consist of members that have been put in those groups based on their bodies. And so long as the issue is difference, Oyewumi argues that these biologically rooted explanations will be found in Western thought, and we'll continue to find these explanations compelling. So in Oyewumi's view, biological determinism and social constructionism are just two sides of the very same coin, and both of them reinforce each other. When social categories like gender are constructed, new biologies of difference are invented in which to root them. That is, social categories of gender, race, class, etc., derive their legitimacy from the biological. Without male and female, what would man and woman mean? We couldn't have gender categories without categories of sex. The social categories that we have, that we claim to be socially constructed, are dependent upon biologic in the sense that they're dependent upon different kinds of bodies. So, Oyewumi asks us to wonder what would the world be like if we didn't rely primarily on vision as a tool of biologic. Oyewumi admits that it would entail radical changes. However, perception in the world goes farther if we rely on hearing, for example, rather than vision. How do we know things about people? We give a priority to vision as a cognitive function. When we see people, we immediately categorize them into what we call social categories, right? If we look at a person, we categorize them as a certain gender, biological sex, race, possibly ethnicity, class, and several other social categories. But if these social categories, these ways in which we know people and classify people, are based on their body, then we're relying on vision in a way that contributes to our biologic, that reinforces a kind of biological determinism that we seem to suggest that we're trying to refute. Giving priority to vision as a cognitive function it's not natural, it's a cultural phenomenon. Oyewumi discusses how in the Yoruba culture, they rely on hearing. The auditory sense is primary for them. People are put into social categories not based on what their bodies look like, but based on things that they know through listening to others speak. Yet, not privileging vision isn't even a choice in our society. It's a cognitive skill that we learn from a very young age. What would it be for us to not privilege vision as a society? When we rely on vision in the way that we do in the West, there's an impulse toward not only difference, but hierarchy, particularly when we rely on vision in a way that is tied to biological determinism. For Oyewumi, she doesn't necessarily care if we get rid of biologic, but she doesn't want us to put it on her or her culture and then claim that it's a universal way of being and knowing. Because, in fact, it's not a universal way of being and knowing. And this is problematic for us because we are trying to argue both that all women are oppressed, yet that gender itself is a social construction. But if gender is a social construction, how can we say that women are universally oppressed? All cultures don't necessarily have women as a social category, yet in the West, we take our gender system that is biologically based and apply it to other cultures and societies in order to claim that women are universally oppressed. So, different modes of knowledge acquisition yield dissimilar emphases on types and kinds of evidence for making knowledge claims. In Yoruban society, social relations derive legitimacy from social facts, not from biology. not from facts about people's bodies. So a gender map or gender categories is unhelpful in Yoruban society, whereas gender permeates nearly everything about our social relations in the West. And even feminism is inframed by Biologic, given our over-reliance on vision. And so we miss out on other levels of existence, other ways of being and other ways of knowing.